Good day. Before I begin my discussion, I must unfortunately return to the unhappy subject of the various pirate channels that have been appearing in various places, purporting to be connected to me in some ways. Now, I've been alerted recently about a particular platform, maybe less a channel, on Instagram, which has been using my name to sell various cryptocurrency products. And as far as I know, there are probably others doing the same thing. Let me repeat again my warning. I have absolutely nothing to do with any of these platforms or channels that are pirating my work and using my identity in order to sell themselves or whatever products they may be purporting to sell. There's nothing to do with me. The Duran, I myself, various other people to my knowledge, have been reporting the activities of all of these channels and entities to the various platforms, and it will be for them to decide what to do about them and whether to take them down and how quickly. I can do no more myself other than to give again my repeated warning that there is only one place where you will find my work, and that is on the two channels run by us on the Duran. This channel, Alexander Mercouris, where I'm broadcasting this video, and the Duran channel itself. Obviously, I do appear as guests on other channels from time to time, but that is easy to identify. Anything else, any other channel purporting to be by me, any other website purporting to be connected to me in some way, that has nothing to do with me. And if it's being used for fraudulent purposes, well, I suppose in a sense all of these channels are being used for fraudulent purposes. But if a particular scam is going on, then that is a very serious matter indeed, and please be aware of it, and please keep well away. Well, having said all of this, I think it's perhaps best if I now turn to the topic of our discussion, which of course, again, is the war in Ukraine. And yesterday I discussed how Russian officials have now taken to discussing the situation in Bakhmut as indeed now a cauldron situation. And we've had more comments about this over the course of the last couple of hours. There's also been reports, again from Russian officials, about how some Ukrainian troops are trying to escape the cauldron. And we've had a comment from Yan Gagin, who is somebody we've heard of many times, an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting leader of the Donetsk People's Republic. Anyway, he said on Russia 24 television this morning that small groups have been fleeing Bakhmut on the dirt roads. And he went on to say, I do not rule out attempts to break out of the city itself, as small groups of Ukrainian troops have been retreating in a chaotic manner. And the implication is that this is something which is happening without direct orders from Kiev or the Ukrainian command. Whether that is so or not, I don't know. But when Gagin uses the word chaotic, that suggests that some people in Bakhmut are basically now trying to escape the encirclement and are taking decisions into their own hands. Anyway, there's been a lot of other comments about the state of things in Bakhmut, and we've had more comments from Yan Gagin about the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut. Again, it's in the same interview on Russia 24. He said that the city of Bakhmut which Kiev has for some time described as the Ukrainian forces' impregnable fortress, has turned into a veritable black hole. He, President Vladimir Zelensky, has long called it a fortress city, the loss of which, in principle, would be tantamount to the loss of the front line. The fortress city has now turned into a black hole that sucks in enemy manpower. And there's on that last point, Gagin discusses what the Ukrainians are doing in terms of trying to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut. He says that he said the following. He said that given the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces, which are in the hundreds every day, hundreds of troops every day, it's not entirely right to hold the town. Things don't look great for them at the moment. Well, that's an understatement. And then he goes on to say they are nonetheless throwing in reserves there. They are preparing new reserves. They have now moved a new battalion there. But the question is, how will they deploy it there on roads that are controlled by our artillery? So Gagin is saying that the Ukrainians are trying to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut itself, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to do so because even though they had a whole battalion ready to be sent into Bakhmut, it's unable, in effect, to get in because Russian artillery now controls all the roads. And the last point was again made by Gagin in that same interview. Our artillery, our vehicles are already in the city. They control almost half of Artyomivsk. Half of Artyomivsk. Artyomivsk is, of course, Bakhmut. Now, other people on the Russian side are talking about the actions of Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, the fact that they're trying to rush troops to try to prevent the situation in Bakhmut collapsing. And again, we have more comments, this time from another one of our old friends, retired Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Marochko. And he's been talking, as I understand it, to TASS, where, by the way, I should say, I've been getting all of these reports from. And Marochko says the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces is trying to prevent a complete encirclement of Artyomivsk, in other words, Bakhmut. This is why they redeploy more or less combat-ready units to the west of the town. Positions in the area of supply roads have been reinforced. And Marochko also noted that the Ukrainian forces stepped up artillery operations and were shelling Russian troops from the town of Chasov Yar. And that's, in other words, the Ukrainians have not given up in Bakhmut, even though their troops are, in effect, encircled there. So lots of information coming, as I said, from various Russian representatives. And, of course, we've also heard a great deal from Yevgeny Prigozhin over the last couple of days. And he's again been active. He says that Ukraine is now trying to build up more of its forces in and around Bakhmut. And he's talking about a possible Ukrainian breakthrough attempt to Bakhmut. He's identified various units of the Ukrainian army in Slavyansk, in Chasov Yar, in Seversk, that could, in theory, be used to carry out a operation to break the siege of Bakhmut. He says that if everybody on the Russian side does their work properly, then such a breakthrough will not occur, and the Russian victory in Bakhmut will be achieved. But he makes it clear that this is far from over, and he repeats, of course, his now classic constant demand for more ammunition for his artillery forces. So the picture that we're getting from the Russians is of the Ukrainians suffering extremely heavy losses in Bakhmut and being effectively in a state of encirclement, and the Ukrainians nonetheless still trying to hold on, trying to retain control of at least Bakhmut, or at least part of Bakhmut, that part of Bakhmut that they control, considering a breakthrough attempt, an attempt to break these Russian positions around Bakhmut, and of a battle that in Gagin's words has turned into a black hole for Ukrainian manpower, and with claims also that some Ukrainian troops just aren't able to cope anymore and have been fleeing from Bakhmut in small groups in a chaotic way, suggesting, as I said, that this has not been organized by Kiev. Anyway, that's what various Russian officials have been saying. There's also been certain comments by the most senior Russian military official of all, who is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. Now, the account of what he's been saying has not been yet published in English on the Russian Defense Ministry website, but it's been widely reported in the Russian media, including by TASS. And I'm going first to the rather short dispatch from TASS about Shoigu's words, which focuses principally on Ukrainian casualties. And TASS's report about Shoigu's comments made at a conference in the Russian Defense Ministry reads as follows. The losses of Ukrainian troops jumped by 40% in February, surpassing 11,000 men, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said during a conference call with top commanders of the Russian armed forces. There's considerable growth of losses among the personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces. In February alone, they increased by more than 40% compared with January and totaled more than 11,000 servicemen. In connection with this, it's surprising how the Kiev regime doesn't care about its people, tolerating any cost to human life to please its Western handlers. Now, I should say that if you go back and look at Shoigu's report from January, in January he claimed that 6,500 Ukrainian troops had been killed over the course of January. He's now saying that in February that jumped to 11,000, and of course not all of them will have been killed in Bakhmut, but it's likely, if Shoigu's claims are true, which of course I cannot corroborate, but it's likely that most of them were. So that's what TASS reports Shoigu as saying. But other parts of the Russian media have spoken at much greater length about his words, and they're quite interesting. Now, this is what has been said by one particular Russian newspaper, RGRU. Now, I want to stress this is not an official translation. This is basically a machine translation, somewhat polished up by myself. But anyway, this is the headline. Shoigu, the capture of Artyomovsk, in other words, Bakhmut, will allow the Russian armed forces to continue the offensive deep into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. And he goes on to say, taking control of the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk People's Republic will allow the Russian armed forces to carry out a further offensive deep into the defenses of the Ukrainian army. And this was stated by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu during a conference call with the leadership of the Russian armed forces. And according to Shoigu, the liberation of, well, it's referred to as Artyomovsk, but we're talking about Bakhmut, is currently underway. The city is an important center of defense of the Ukrainian military in Donbass. Taking it under control will allow further offensive actions deep into the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine. And Shoigu also recalled the liberation as a result of the offensive of the Russian armed forces in the Donetsk and Kupiansk directions of Nikolaevka, Dvorechnoye, Krasnaya Gora, Gryanikovka, and Paraskovievka. Note, by the way, it doesn't seem to be mentioning the role of the Wagner Group in liberating all these places, but we'll put that aside. In addition, and then it goes on to say, Shoigu drew attention to the fact that NATO's support for Kiev has not yet led to the success of the armed forces of Ukraine on the battlefield. On the contrary, there is a significant increase in losses amongst the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. Thus, according to the Minister of Defense, in February, the losses of the Ukrainian army increased by more than 40% compared to January and reached over 11,000. So that's what one Russian newspaper is reporting Shoigu as saying. So if we read this carefully, what Shoigu is saying is Bakhmut is captured. We're not going to stop. We're going to press on. We're going to advance more deeply into Ukrainian positions. We're going to launch offensives to capture even more ground from Ukraine. And he also talks about Bakhmut there as, in effect, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense system. Well, that's what the Russians have been saying. What have the Ukrainians been saying? Well, yesterday I spoke about a report from BITCHUTE, which spoke about the enormous losses Ukraine has suffered in Bakhmut, defending Bakhmut. And it also said that General Zelensky, some weeks ago, asked President Zelensky to endorse a withdrawal from Bakhmut, but that Zelensky refused. Well, a few hours later, perhaps in response to that BITCHUTE article, President Zelensky's office published this statement. On Monday, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, held a regular meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The commanders of the operational and strategic groups reported on the situation on the main front lines. The members of the staff considered the situation in Bakhmut in particular. Assessing the course of the defense operation, the President asked Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, and Commander of the Operational and Strategic Grouping of Troops, Khortytsia Alexander Syrsky, about further actions in the Bakhmut direction. They, that's to say Zaluzhny and Syrsky, spoke in favor of continuing the defense operation and further strengthening our positions in Bakhmut. So, according to Zelensky's office, the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian military leadership, is united in its determination to defend and hold on to Bakhmut. And we saw Gagin talking about the fact that Ukraine has tried to send another battalion into Bakhmut to try to reinforce the troops there. Prigozhin has been talking about Ukraine also sending troops close to Bakhmut. Marochko has been saying the same thing. All the indications are that Ukraine is not giving up on this battle. At least the leadership of Ukraine are not giving up on this battle. Some troops may be leaving Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops may be leaving Bakhmut. Maybe they're doing so in scattered groups under command from their superiors, or maybe they're fleeing. But the Ukrainian leadership as a whole, despite the critical situation, despite the fact that Bakhmut now finds itself in a cauldron, are apparently determined to keep the battle going. And that, of course, opens up the question of whether indeed we are going to see this Ukrainian attempt to break in to Bakhmut. And that's an interesting question to which, of course, I am not in a position to give an answer. I would have thought that for Ukraine to do that, it would be extremely difficult. I would have thought that that would be a challenging operation indeed, and perhaps not even a wise one. I would have thought that it would make more sense to try and extract these troops from Bakhmut, perhaps negotiating some sort of truce to allow them to withdraw, rather than to send more men and more machines and more troops to attack Russian forces now that are encircling Bakhmut. But the possibility of an attack does exist, and you see from his comments that Prigozhin himself takes it very seriously. He feels that the military, the forces that are Russian forces that are besieging Bakhmut, need to be prepared for this, and he's talking about the need to do that, and he says if this isn't done, well, it will be a debacle for the Russian side, which it would be, by the way. So, anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians do. In this connection, I saw a very interesting report. I think it was again on Slavyangrad, the Telegram channel that provides a lot of very interesting and helpful commentary about the progress of the war, and provides reports of the actual fighting, which, as I said, on balance, I've found consistently reliable. But anyway, I did read a report that there's been some suggestions that before Ukraine launches its much touted spring offensive, some of its troops, it will use some of its troops who've been prepared for this offensive. It will test them out in fighting somewhere on the front line, and that this will be done in order to perfect and establish whether the training and the tactics that these troops have received has been up to the right standard, and whether an offensive is possible. And anyway, basically to give these troops experience of actual fighting before they undertake an offensive itself. And this particular report suggested that some of these units might be used in an attempt to break into Bakhmut, and that this might happen at some point over the next 2 weeks. Well, it's possible, and it's consistent with some of the reports we've been hearing about a pile-up of Ukrainian troops and equipment, Western equipment and artillery in Chasov Yar, and perhaps something like that is indeed being planned. But I'm sure, as I said, that the Russians will be keeping an eye out for it, and we'll see what will happen. Anyway, it's clear that Ukraine is not prepared to give up Bakhmut at this point, despite it becoming a black hole, despite the enormous losses that Ukraine has suffered as a result of its commitment to hold on to Bakhmut. And some kind of Ukrainian attack to relieve the garrison in Bakhmut is far from impossible or even unlikely. Meanwhile, I am going to say something about the state of the losses that Ukraine is suffering in Bakhmut, because we're now getting all kinds of reports about this and about the increasing demoralization of Ukrainian soldiers who have been defending Bakhmut. And I should say that these reports, which are from Bild Zeitung and from the Kiev Independent, I've taken from the Moon of Alabama, and that's where I found these extracts. Anyway, let's start with Bild Zeitung. This is the report that appeared, which spoke about dissension between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. And I'll read the passage. President Volodymyr Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, have conflicting views on how the military should handle the situation in Bakhmut, according to unnamed sources within the Ukrainian political leadership. Bild writes that Zaluzhny was deliberating a tactical withdrawal from Bakhmut weeks ago over concern for the well-being of his troops. The Ukrainian government told Bild that remaining in Bakhmut was the right decision due to the serious damage it inflicted on Russian military personnel and equipment. However, according to other sources, the situation is at risk of becoming untenable. The vast majority of soldiers in Bakhmut do not understand why the city is being held, a Ukrainian military analyst told Bild on condition of anonymity. And then there's been a really very distressing report, also covered by the Moon of Alabama, from the Kiev and Independent. And it talks about how multiple defenders of this embattled city, that's to say Bakhmut in Donetsk, feel that they're in a similar boat, in other words, that they're being sacrificed, according to interviews with more than a dozen soldiers currently fighting in and or around Bakhmut. During their brief visits to the nearby town of Konstantinovka, Ukrainian infantry told the Kiev Independent of unprepared, poorly trained battalions being thrown into the front line, meat grinder, to survive as best they could with little support from armoured vehicles, mortars, artillery, drones, and tactical information. And then there's extensive quotations from two soldiers called Sergei, both in their 40s, and they say that they lack everything that would support their defense, that Russian artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers are often allowed to strike Ukrainian positions for hours or days without being shot down by Ukrainian heavy weapons. Some complained of poor coordination and situational awareness, allowing this to happen or making it even worse. And these are obviously more people than just the two Sergeys, but we then go on to read. Mortarmen spoke of extreme ammunition scarcity and having to use weapons dating back to World War II. Drones that are supposed to provide critical reconnaissance information are also scarce and are being lost at very high rates in some parts of the battlefield. All this leads to terrifying casualties. Remember, this is the Kiev Independent talking about the situation of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut. All this leads to terrifying casualties of both dead and wounded. The battalion came in the middle of December. Between all the different platoons, there were 500 of us, says Boris, a combat medic from Odessa Oblast fighting around Bakhmut. A month ago, there were literally 150 of us. So this battalion has gone down from 500 to just 150. And then the older Sergei is quoted by the Kiev Independent as saying, when you go out to the position, it's not even a 50-50% chance that you'll come out of there alive. It's more like 30-70. And there's then a very interesting discussion from the two Sergeys about actual Russian tactics. And as the Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt correctly says, this essentially refutes the claims about waves of Russian troops being launched recklessly to try and overwhelm Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. And the Kiev Independent says this: the older Sergei says that the enemy likes to send a team of 3 or 4 expendable foot soldiers to attack and make the Ukrainians expose themselves by shooting at them. At that point, the more elite forces zero in on the defenders' position. Once they begin exchanging fire, the Ukrainians are struck with heavier weapons, like Russian mortars and rockets from Grad multiple launch rocket systems, or BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and BTR armored personnel carriers with machine guns. They get the positions where we are, establish the coordinates, then they hit us from 7 to 9 kilometers out with mortars, as well as from closer by with grenade launchers, says the older Sergei. They wait for the house to fall, so we have to jump out, the building catches fire, and then they try to finish us off. And then the younger Sergei chips in: their birds come out and they chase us with fire. And he's now referring to Russian drones, like quadcopters and Orlan 10 fixed-wing drones that spot distant heavy weapons. They hit accurately. And as Russia is destroying more and more buildings, Ukrainians keep losing more and more places where they can reliably take cover. Boris, the medic, says people have been lost when their entrenched positions collapsed from heavy Russian fire, suffocating them. I'll put it like this: we should get our people out, because if we don't take off, then in the next few weeks it's going to be bad. A mortarman named Ilya agrees that Bakhmut is practically encircled. And then Kiev Independent goes on to say multiple soldiers say Bakhmut troops are barely given enough time to learn to shoot a rifle. Sometimes their training is just 2 weeks before they're dropped into the hottest parts of the most intense current battle of the war. They would have preferred for troops to get a minimum of 2 or 3 months of training before being deployed to such a hot spot. 2 weeks live training and they're sent here. You can't do that, says the older Sergei. Or it's a person who once served in the army. How long ago was that? Obviously, they forgot everything. We were promised that we wouldn't be sent to the 0 line right away, that at first we'd be sent to the 2nd or 3rd line, and then we came here in the middle of the night and they immediately sent us to Bakhmut. According to both soldiers named Sergei, most brigades are insufficiently trained and lack the experience for an environment as brutal as Bakhmut. People are taken at night to a place they'd never seen before, and the battle starts in the morning. This is why positions are abandoned. People are there for the first time, says the younger Sergei. I went to a position 3 times and was given 6 people who hadn't fought at all before. We had a few dead and wounded that had to be evacuated. Our people are not being protected. And then another Ukrainian soldier, Alexander, confirms that while some battalions fighting in Bakhmut are well trained and ready, most of them aren't, and many were thrown in at night without much preparation. Yes, that's true. My battalion was not prepared. After 5 months without a single break from the fighting, only half of Alexander's battalion is left. They shouldn't have rushed to throw everyone in there, says the younger Sergei. Better to abandon those positions. Who cares? It's better to train people properly. So that's on the Kiev Independent, as I said, courtesy of the Moon of Alabama. You get a sense of what's been happening in Bakhmut. Ukraine's been throwing in ill-trained troops to try to hold on to Bakhmut. These troops have been killed in huge numbers. Many more of them have been wounded. Perhaps it's unsurprising that, according to the Russians, some of them are trying to flee across the fields. Well, that's Bakhmut. Lots going on elsewhere on the battlefields, and there's still much rumour and talk about the Ukrainian spring or summer offensive. And there was another report on the Russian channel which claimed that the Pentagon has done some kind of war game exercise looking at 3 possible options for an offensive, trying to work out where the best prospects for an offensive would be. I noticed that one of the possible objectives is Kremenaya in the north, but the other 2 are said to be in the south, in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. Now, I have to say, I have no idea how this Russian channel would have got access to information about war games in the Pentagon. It attributes this information to information provided by the Russian General Staff, which would imply that the Russians have some kind of leak within the Pentagon. Perhaps they have. I think it's most unlikely, if they have, that they would publish that or allow that to be published in this kind of way in the media. But who knows? There is still a huge amount of talk about this Ukrainian spring offensive. The Germans have said that they're rushing to complete the training of the Ukrainian troops on the Leopard 2s by some point in March. The Polish government claims that a Patriot missile battery has now been sent to Ukraine. We've not seen it in action, and the implication is that it's come from Poland. I presume this is the German Patriot battery that was located in Poland, that's now been transferred to Ukraine. Well, we'll find out in due course. We know that some of the wheeled tanks from France have all arrived in Ukraine. So this hodgepodge of weapons is being hurriedly put together and sent to Ukraine as fast as possible, presumably in preparation for this spring offensive. Now, there were 2 reports from TASS which confirm, or appear to confirm, what I discussed yesterday, that Shoigu's trips around the battlefronts, and in particular his trip to Mariupol, was probably to check out, intended in part at least, to check out the defenses, the Russian defenses in this area. And one of these reports is from Vladimir, it's from TASS, but it quotes Vladimir Rogov, who is an official of the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye region government. And in fact, it's not Valery Rogov, I should correct that. It is, in fact, Yevgeny Belitsky, who is, in fact, the acting governor of the Russian-controlled areas of Zaporozhye. Anyway, Belitsky is reported by TASS as having said the following. Russian forces in the Zaporozhye region have seen their conditions on the battlefield improve in recent months, especially in terms of staffing and equipment, the region's acting governor, Yevgeny Belitsky, said on Monday. The regiments are manned and equipped fully with all the forces and means in place. The current situation is much better than several months ago, he said in an interview with Krim 24 television channel. That's a Crimean television channel. And we also read in TASS that Russian defenses have been beefed up in another part of the south. And this is, it reads as follows. Russian troops are reinforcing fortifications on the eastern bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, a fighter with the call sign Fizruk told TASS on Tuesday. We are building fortifications at this line. We will now block the cracks, get ready to reinforce our defenses. We're on the left bank of the Dnieper River. We work on the fortifications every day in between incoming shelling and fighting. He said the fortifications are being reinforced to endure hits with artillery and mortars. We are doing this work day and night. If there's shelling during the day, we start at night. Well, and then the dispatch from TASS finishes. According to the soldier, Ukrainian troops carry out surveillance from the opposite bank. They have also set up radio warfare units. So, both sides are making their preparations. Now, I'm going to make one quick observation about this. The Ukrainian offensives of the autumn in Kharkiv and Kherson region took place in rather different circumstances. The offensive against Kharkiv region was launched against an area, a location of the battlefronts where the Russians had pulled out most of their troops. So a significant Ukrainian force was able to make a rapid advance, though at the price of heavy losses against recovering territory, which in many cases was not strongly defended. There were very, very few Russian troops there. My own assessment is that if one is talking about regular Russian army troops, there were perhaps 1,000 men in this particular area of the battlefronts at a time when this Ukrainian force, perhaps 9,000 men, perhaps more, stormed into Kharkiv region in the autumn. So this doesn't look like the same situation at all now. On the contrary, we see that the Russians have been heavily reinforcing in Kharkiv, in the areas of the battlefront where the Ukrainian attack is expected to come, in Kherson region and in Zaporozhye. And in fact, there's been more satellite photos now which show the enormous defense lines that the Russians have created in this area. And I have to say, given that they started doing this well before the new year, soon after General Surovikin was appointed to his initial post of theatre commander, well, I can't help but think that the Russians must have had some intelligence from somewhere, we'll come to that in a moment, that such an offensive was being planned, and that's why they've been taking all these steps to prepare for it. Deploying troops obviously takes time, but it can be done fairly quickly, presumably. Building elaborate fortifications of the sort that we've been seeing in these photos looks like prescience. In other words, it looks like the Russians had actual information about what the Ukrainians and their Western sponsors were thinking about. Now, as I said, we'll come to that and we'll discuss possible sources of these leaks shortly. And the other thing that the other offensive, which is of course against Kherson region, it's important to stress that despite the very large numbers of troops and equipment that Ukraine deployed against the Russian forces on Kherson region west of the Dnieper River, the Ukrainians never achieved a breakthrough in this area. They suffered extremely heavy losses, but they never broke through. The Russians took a decision based on logistic considerations and based on considerations of where the stronger defense line might lie, to withdraw from Kherson region. So it was not quite the breakthrough that Ukraine perhaps was looking to achieve. And of course, it's difficult to imagine, much more difficult to imagine, that the Russians would want to carry out the same kind of retreat in the Zaporozhye region as well. Though we'll have to wait and see. We'll see what the Russians intend to do. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefronts today. Let's just talk briefly now about possible leaks of information, how the Russians might have got wind of where the principal axis of a Ukrainian advance would come in Zaporozhye region, how it came about, that the Russians perhaps know about war games that have been taking place in the US. I want to stress again, I don't know, I have no inside information about any leaks at all. But over the last couple of hours, President Zelensky has carried out another major reshuffling of the leadership of the SBU, Ukraine's principal counterintelligence and internal security service. Many of its top officials have been replaced, including its most senior official, the person who was running it, and they've been placed by others. And I wonder whether one possible reason is that the US, and perhaps some people in Ukraine itself, at the level of the general staff, have been getting increasingly concerned about the amount of information that the Russians seem to be getting, and the assumption must be that it's being leaked to the Russians from sources in Kiev, and that the SBU is failing to plug these leaks. Well, it's a thought, it's a possibility. Whilst I am dealing with these particular issues of spies and intelligence and partisan activities and all that kind of thing, I would just say that there's also been reports over the last couple of hours that in Belarus there's been a roundup of around 20 people who were said to have been involved in that drone attack on the airbase in Minsk, the one which attempted but failed to damage the A-50U AWACS aircraft located at that airfield. So this particular operation, apparently launched from people operating within Belarus, some Belarusians were involved. The Belarusian security agencies seem to have been very effective indeed in rounding up all of the people involved, and perhaps that's a contrast with the SBU, which doesn't seem to be so successful in plugging leaks in Ukraine, which is why we've seen this major reshuffle take place there. Let me also say that there's been almost total silence from Ukraine about that raid by those alleged Russian volunteers, on Bryansk region about a couple of days ago. The ones that led to the attack on the two villages, the killing of the two civilians, the wounding of at least one child, though, as I said, the Russian authorities have not yet, in fact, provided us with a full account of what's happened. I'm going to say straight away that, in my opinion, that Bryansk attack was a public relations disaster. One of the individuals involved, who was a Russian soldier, a former Russian, but when I say a soldier, he's based in this militia group. He gave interviews to various Western outlets, including the Financial Times. His extreme political beliefs became quickly apparent, and most embarrassingly, he confirmed that the attack in Bryansk had been conducted with the assistance of the Ukrainian authorities. So, lots of things going wrong at the moment on the covert front. Ukrainians have shown some skill in this area. They launched another attempted assassination of the Russian businessman, oligarch, Konstantin Malofeyev, who is on some kind of a sanctions list now, at least an alleged attack on him. The Russian authorities claim that they did. But we see that a lot of these attacks, these pinprick attacks, are running into problems and are causing more problems for Ukraine than they are solving. 20 people have been arrested in Belarus, and the attack on Bryansk has made Western readers who track these things notice that their newspapers are reporting the fact that a unit led by an individual with extreme right views caused an attack, carried out an attack on Russian territory with the assistance of the Ukrainian authorities. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about those things. I want to now discuss briefly the diplomatic picture, because it's clear to me that there is now genuine discussion and debate on the part of some people in the West about what to do and how to move forward and how the West can extricate itself from this extremely difficult situation. And the Indian punchline, M.S. Bhadrakumar, the Indian diplomat who writes us, the Indian punchline, he's discussed very acutely, very interestingly, the very mysterious trip that Chancellor Scholz of Germany recently conducted to Washington. And I get to read what Bhadrakumar says about this. He says, the dash for the White House in Washington on Friday by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz remains a riddle wrapped in a mystery. Scholz landed in D.C. without, just to add again, there were no journalists with him from Germany, no business people. It was a small group of officials who accompanied Scholz. Scholz landed in D.C., drove to the White House, and was received by President Biden in the Oval Office for a conversation that lasted over an hour. No aides were present. And then Scholz flew back to Berlin. And we then go on to read that, this is from M.S. Bhadrakumar's site, Associated Press reported cryptically, if any agreements were reached or plans made, the White House wasn't saying. Scholz had insisted whilst leaving Berlin that he and Biden want to talk directly with each other. Scholz mentioned a global situation where things have become very difficult, which could imply concerns about China as well. And he said, it is important that such close friends can talk about all of these questions together continually. Now, this is a very strange situation. It's most peculiar when something like this happens. Now, back in 2015, during a critical moment in the fighting in Ukraine, when Ukrainian forces were trapped in Debaltseve, a place called Debaltseve, just as they're trapped in Bakhmut today, the German Chancellor of that time, Angela Merkel, did a sudden dash to Moscow, and she had a meeting, private meeting, without aides with President Putin. And the Minsk agreement was the outcome of that. What we're seeing is something which is both similar and different. Ukrainian troops are trapped in Bakhmut, and the German Chancellor again makes a hurried trip abroad, but this time not to Russia, but to the United States. And once more, the meeting, this time not with the Russian president, but with the US president, takes place behind closed doors with no aides present. It's all most curious. And we don't know, as Associated Press tells us, what was discussed over the course of this meeting. Clearly something was discussed. They spoke for over an hour, and one wonders what it was that they said to each other. Now, as Badrakuma points out, the readout, the official readout of the meeting is extremely uninformative. Does contain the words about two having exchanged perspectives on other global issues apart from Ukraine, but talking about the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine and things of that kind. It doesn't stray from orthodoxies, but it doesn't give any real feel for why this discussion took place and what was discussed. And as Badrakuma also points out, in the remarks that Biden made before the meeting went private, remarks which have been published on the White House website, Biden goes out of his way to talk up Scholz, to pay tribute to him, to talk about his strong and steady leadership and things of that kind. In fact, Biden is unusually effusive. Now, having said that, it is strange. This meeting is strange. And I can't help but wonder whether behind all the flowery words, and Biden's words are so effusive, that I think that, if anything, they tend to point in a different direction. I wonder whether there are now strong disagreements starting to surface between the two men, whether Biden and Scholz actually don't agree on certain things, and that is why they met in private, and why none of the aides were present, and why the press was kept away. In other words, there was, well, perhaps not a row, but let's say an argument. Now, it could have been an argument about Ukraine. It could have been an argument about relations with China. I'm going to discuss the Chinese aspect in my next video. But about Ukraine, it's important to say that things at the moment are not going terribly well in Ukraine. And Badrakuma has discussed to some extent the falling support in the United States and Germany for continued support for Ukraine, and the difficult situation in Ukraine at the present time, and the way nothing seems to be working out as planned over the course of the conflict in Ukraine. But though Badrakuma's analysis is of a high standard, I think it's actually surpassed by John Helmer's in Dancing with Bears. Talks about much the same situation. And Helmer makes the point that the kind of strategy that the Russians have been conducting, the way they've been conducting this military operation, has thrown all Western calculations into chaos, and it's also undermined those personalities, the oligarchs, the former oligarchs, if you like, people like Deripaska within Russia, who might have been expected, who in fact not only might be expected, but who do advocate a strong pro-American course. Helmer makes the point that as the Russian, I'm quoting now, as the Russian military strategy succeeds on the battlefield, the political will of people in Europe must also be transformed, and this is happening. not every battle on every front can be explained at once, and he then goes on to discuss certain things. He goes into great granular detail about the polling data and why the polling data is actually worrying for Western leaders. He points out that Western governments, without exceptions, or at least European governments, without exception, are actually brittle coalitions, not particularly secure. And he also discusses Article 5 of the NATO Treaty and the fact that Article 5 doesn't actually automatically require one NATO state to come to the defense of another NATO state in the event of an attack, whatever people might think it does. It's actually slightly more loosely worded than that suggests. And Helmer also makes the point, previously also discussed by Emmanuel Todd, the French sociologist and anthropologist and historian, that in the event that there were a Western debacle in Ukraine, it would be critical for the West. It would create a crisis situation for the West as well. It would mean that there would, from that moment on, be serious doubts about the viability, the future viability of NATO and of the American guarantee to the European states. So this is becoming a very high-risk situation, and perhaps one can understand why Scholz and Biden might have a lot to talk about, as the two of them, in private, explore options. So they do this in private, they keep their aides away, and it's not difficult to guess which aides they might be particularly concerned to keep away. Victoria Nuland, Sullivan, Blinken, the neocons in the US, Habeck, and of course, above all, Baerbock, who is the foreign minister, and her team in the case of Scholz. Now, whether or not Biden himself is particularly open to any suggestions from Scholz about ways to find a way out of this crisis is a completely different matter. I've never got the sense that he's been anything other than a hardliner in this affair. But against that, we have had this report that when he was in Poland and he met with the leaders of some of the East European states, including the Baltic states, he appears to have told them that they should lower their expectations of what can be achieved in this war, and that some of them came away disheartened and thinking to themselves that Biden no longer believes in victory. Anyway, there we are. It's a complex situation at the moment. Bakhmut is now, as I said, in a cauldron. The Ukrainian troops are in a cauldron. They're suffering very heavy losses. There's rumours of some sort of Ukrainian breakthrough attempt to try to relieve the troops there. There's concerns about this on the Russian side. And at the same time, looming over everything, there's worries about a Ukrainian counteroffensive. But we've now had official confirmation, or semi-official confirmation, from no less a person than Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, that once Bakhmut is captured, the Russians will continue their offensive. They will strike deep into the defensive areas of Ukraine. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in this situation of crisis, the two most powerful leaders of the West, Biden and Scholz, are meeting with each other, and they're talking to each other in private, making sure that the aids and the microphones, one presumes, are kept away. All complicated, all interesting, and we will see over the next few days how things transpire. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.